for the newsroom, and just to let you know, you are also welcome to participate in this conversation. The hashtag is Morning Express KTN. You can also tweet, and the Twitter handles are going to be displayed as we carry on with the show. Let me introduce the panel that we have this morning. And to my extreme left, we have Dr. Nancy Booker, who is the assistant professor at Aga Khan University. Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We have Patrick Gadara, who is a communications consultant and also a cartoonist. I haven't seen your cartoons in a while, though.
No, I've been doing them for a bit. I'm not curating the elephant, though.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. I thought maybe you began resisting cartooning. That's a story for another day. Julie Masiga, who is a journalist, thank you for joining us this morning.
Mike, don't say anything about me.
I will be. I'll gag myself. All right. So good to have you guys. And well, basically, newsroom, for those of us who might not be aware, is where we look at what we in the media, the Fourth Estate, have been doing, and whether we can do a better job, and also some of those stories that have been making headlines and how we have covered them. Now, I want to start with an article that was written by yours truly, Dr. Nancy Booker, and it is titled, "Dear Journalists, Spare Us the Jargon, Make Election Petition Story Juicy." And of course, we do know that we have the petition now in the Supreme Court, and for the next 2 weeks, it's likely to be part of what's going to form the headlines. So, Dr. Booker, maybe starting from what maybe our experience was with the previous petition. I think Kenya is unique in the sense that we've had this happen twice in a very short time. So hopefully we've not forgotten what we should have learned during the last petition. Maybe we start with your thoughts on how the petition was covered initially.
Thank you, and thank you for having me back into the show. I was not resisting, I need to say that. But, I think a couple of things is that, you know, with the last petition, part of the challenge was media practitioners familiarizing themselves with the Constitution, the Elections Act, the Elections Offences Act, and basically the court processes. And the challenge was that I think as we got into the election cycle, there was a lot of training that was done, but very little on court reporting. Which, again, you know, should not excuse it, because in the build-up to the run-up to the election, there was a lot of scenario mapping by media houses, and we should have seen it. You know, that is a possibility if you know, if it was not clear who the winner was. But then the other thing is that for many of the viewers out there, when we see lawyers on set, and most of the times politically aligned lawyers, each of them comes out and says the Constitution is very clear, yes. You know. But then what they end up, you know, speaking about or saying makes it very clear for one side of the political divide. And the next person who's, you know, on the opposing side also comes out and says the Constitution is very clear and takes it on an opposite tangent altogether. So the question is that then for us at home who are watching, what does that then portend for us? And in essence then, it basically tells us that, you know, some of these documents are interpreted, you know, to suit a political angle. And that's where now the media should come in. And hence the reason why in my article I talk about it's not just enough for us to go and interview, you know, the political contestants or their spokespersons. It's important for us to also interrogate the documents. It's important for us to understand what's in those petitions. What is it that is being, you know, that is before the judges, understanding the court processes, so that then we can interrogate, you know, some of those panelists from a position of knowledge. We can, you know, be that middle ground that, you know, is reasonable, and saying, you know, whereas this is what the different political parties are saying, this is what it actually means. Right. Are we in a good place? Yes, we are, as media. One, that we have a number of journalists who have gone into law and are studying law, and hopefully that then will build into the kind of content that we are receiving. But secondly, that we have you know, another chance to be able to correct some of those things in the petition that is now before the Supreme Court. There have been lessons learned. Media have been taking stock about what they did right and what they did not do right, and hopefully that, you know, the coverage of this petition will go beyond just going live into you know, the courtrooms and reporting the proceedings, to break that down for the everyday consumer.
All right, Julie, you're a journalist and you probably, I don't know if you view it as Dr. Booker does, but here you are sometimes caught in between where you have to report what's happening live. This is what, you know, is really going on. You have the challenge of also ensuring that you have news given within a certain time frame, but at the same time, you're supposed to have literally understood, just like, hopefully like a lawyer, because like Dr. Booker says, when every lawyer stands up, the law is very clear, but it's clear towards their way of, you know, things that they want to go.
Yeah.
When the other lawyer stands up, they also say it's very clear and gives you a completely different view.
Yeah.
How do we ensure that the people at home are not just following what I call a follow-up? We're just not just putting microphones there and we hear what they said, but really there's no breakdown of what does that really mean?
What does it mean? I think the challenge then is to find constitutional lawyers who are not particularly aligned to one party or another.
Exist?
I was about to say it's very hard, find like a needle in a haystack, but that actually is our challenge, because as a journalist, even as somebody who studied law myself, I'm a non-practicing lawyer, the law is very clear, is nonsense. The law is just subject to interpretation, especially the Constitution, the Election Act, and the Offences Act, given the current situation we find ourselves in. We've never been here before, so everybody's interpreting this law. And perhaps the final arbiter should be the Supreme Court, but after that, everybody else is trying to figure out exactly what's happening. Leave alone journalists, even the lawyers themselves, as we have seen. And journalists cannot know everything. You can only know so much. You can't know everything about law, you can't know everything about engineering, you can't know everything about farming. You have to know, there's a finite amount of information that you can store in your head. So the biggest challenge is to find somebody to tell you the truth per the law without any political bias, and then to break that down into a language that people can consume it. I think that's the main challenge. But like you're talking about, if you're on air and it's live and you have to get information out and you're hearing all these big terms, the term I love the best out of all this is illegalities and irregularities, because most people don't know
what was actually legal, what was irregular,
yes,
all this.
What was in that basket. But if you're on the go and you're reporting, especially if you're live on air, you just have to say these things to get the information out there.
Okay, but possibly not to excuse ourselves, you know, and expunge ourselves fully. How important is preparation before? I mean, right now, we have been waiting for the 7 days to elapse.
Yeah.
We know that there is a petition in the Supreme Court, so really, there has been enough time to kind of at least prepare and know what does this mean.
Like Dr. Booker says, we are in a good place. I think we've learned a lot. We've all gone back to our constitutions and to our acts, and we're able to speak with authority on a lot of the issues. I think now again, the challenge is to make this consumable. People understand what you're saying when you're talking about even the time frame. Do people understand why we waited for 7 days, why there's another 8 days before the pre-trial conference? People understand the nuts and the bolts. But in terms of being lawyers ourselves and trying to speak from the perspective of being experts, that's impossible. All we can do is try and understand the issues, get actual experts to tell us what is actually going on, and then try and break that down.
All right. Dadara?
Well, I think that it's not really about the journalists knowing everything. But there are a few basics that I think our journalists need to master. And one of that is the art of simply deconstructing an argument. You know, what you have from the two sides or from the lawyers is simply an argument. They are all presenting their case. Now, if you don't understand what the case actually is, then it becomes very hard to take it apart and to explain it. I think, unfortunately, our journalists get tied into or eroded into certain ways of thinking, so that the lawyers will be pushing you towards one particular point of interpretation, you know, but without letting you see what the entirety of the case is, you know. And I think that's one of my major criticisms for how the 2017 petition was covered, was really to explain what was the case. And it wasn't actually till the very end when Maraga was saying it that lots of people realized what the argument was. And it all gets obfuscated, because don't forget, the lawyers you bring on TV are playing not to the Supreme Court, but to the public court. You know, so there's a political argument that they're carrying on there, and in that they tend to distort what is actually being said. you know, and what it means. And we end up ourselves as media regurgitating some of their more interesting statements, you know, Pythagoras theorem, etc. And we sort of get caught up with this thing, you know, without really asking, have we explained what it is? You know, what is being said and what the argument is. The second thing I would say is we don't seem to have a sense of history. You know, this is not the first petition, so it wasn't even the second petition. You know, we've had petitions all the way since 1992 that have been filed. You know, so it would be good for us to have an idea of how this has progressed, what has been ruled, what have been the problems that have been identified, and especially in the 2013 petition, and to have some reference to what the judges decided then, so that you can build up a context for people. And I think the moment we start doing this, we start explaining rather than simply presenting an arena for this contestation between NASA and Jubilee, you know, that we take our job is to actually ensure the populace understand what's going on, what's being argued, what's being said. Then I think we can be in a much better place. I'm not as sanguine as is too about whether media has learned its lesson.
You don't think we've learned our lesson?
I think the proof will be
How would you say we've not learned our lesson? Yet the petition is not yet even before the court.
Listen to what I said. I'm not as optimistic as they are. And the reason for that is when I look at how the media covered the 2013 process, the entire electoral process, and I covered the 2017 one, I tried to see very many similarities and very many lessons on one that didn't seem to get learned. I don't think we can take it for granted that just because
For example,
a few months ago they went through this process that they will have changed or learned. I mean, take, for example, the reporting just from constituency tallying centers. Of this, most of our media houses, of the election, yeah, exactly. But the election itself happened a month ago. Lots of criticism about how you report it,
right?
And that doesn't seem to change. So my question is, I mean, I would want to see. I mean, I'll give them benefit of doubt and say, all right, fine. I mean, really hope that this time they're not going to, for example, provide the sort of celebrity reporters. You know, because in the last petition, they used, I mean, most of the people who are grounded in the courtrooms, the court reporters, guys who were used to reporting matters of court, weren't used. You brought in your big guns, you know, for those who hadn't been reporting.
I think the big guns did quite well,
you know,
given the
circumstances. So I think the question would be, will the reporting be more grounded, you know? We can give that a benefit of doubt, but I am not very optimistic that we will see a big change from what happened a month ago.
All right,
could I just chime into that? I'd like to give them the benefit of doubt, and for various reasons. That one, whereas we're going back in history, and that's important because then history builds the context. And that's one thing that we have missed, not just even with the reporting on the petitions, but also the elections reporting. But part of that history has been lost because a number of the journalists who've covered this election were not there in 2013. We've all seen that in the last 2-3 years, media houses have downsized, and that has had implications on the quality of journalists that are out there. Should we excuse it? No. Because then if we don't do it right, you know, the public has another place that they can actually go and get that information. And they have, you know, they have proven it to us in the recent past that if we don't, you know, if we don't up our game as media houses, then, you know, they'll be looking for that information elsewhere. I think what this means for us is that in terms of the experts and the lawyers that we bring in and that we, you know, get comments from, that it just calls for us diversifying our sources, going beyond, you know, walking outside a courtroom and finding a lawyer who's available, you know, and, you know, saying, you know, I'm joined here by so-and-so, because, you know, some of those who hang around the courtrooms might not necessarily give you the kind of value that you're looking for. So one, diversifying the sources, which means that then we have to go the extra mile to find, you know, people who can be able to interpret, you know, some of these things. The diversity of opinion is important because in a maturing democracy such as this one, though people would argue that we are not there yet, we are not even maturing, but I believe we are, you know, those contestations is part of what makes us who we are. So it's important to have those different viewpoints, but I think what's, media shouldn't get lost in that muddle, be that voice of reason, so that even when we're interrogating these things, we're interrogating them from a position of knowledge because we have read and we have understood.
We've understood.
Yeah.
Julie, talking about diversity of opinions and especially what we'd call experts and panels, you'll also find that within the media houses, you've sometimes even have a common face. I mean, there'll be somebody who'll be on the show this morning, they'll be on a different station the next. How diverse is that, and what different thing can they bring out when we have the same panel, the same people, basically answering the same questions?
The same questions. That's definitely a problem. But then I'll go back to the fact that, as I've said before, we've been electioneering for a very long time. And we've had thousands and thousands of panels. I know it's not an excuse, but it's a reason. There's a lot of fatigue, especially amongst people in the industry, in the media industry, because we've been at this for a very long time, trying to look for that diversity of opinion, those different voices, over a very sustained period. That said, you do need to have diverse voices. You need to have more women, for example. You need to have people who are not particularly aligned to one party or the other. And you need to have people who actually know what they're talking about in terms of their profession. Like we're talking about lawyers in this conversation. But it's actually a very valid point, because we've been in an echo chamber. We hear the same things all the time. We bring the same people, we ask them the same questions, they tell us we have the same outcome. So we need to actually kind of break that
Could it also
mold.
be a lack of creativity on our part? Because when it comes to analysis, say for the Supreme Court, we have just one template. Have, a panel come in, and it has to be a lawyer, maybe, somebody who's a constitutional lawyer, two of them, and then let's talk about the petition. Could there be other ways that we could do this that would possibly give us a different angle?
One way I think would help is to get, let me not call them ordinary Kenyans, but citizens of the country who are watching, listening, and also want to contribute. What is the opinion of the man on the street? We're not saying people assume that the electorate is ignorant or unaware of the issues. But so many people have things to say and have been absorbing this information and have a different point of view. But we tend to go for the experts, yeah? The people who are coming to tell us a particular thing about a particular topic. What about the people it impacts? I think in the broader scheme of things, we've left out the actual Kenyans from this discussion. We've been preaching and then again talking to ourselves and hearing ourselves back, but not getting the opinions from them. All right,
Gadara, since you're not very optimistic that we have learned the lesson, what is it that you would see within this petition that is currently with the Supreme Court that would make you think, okay, at least a few lessons have been learned?
Well, I mean, once we start covering it?
Yes, once we start covering
it. Okay, well, I think by now we should have been seeing sort of the backgrounding work for that. I think some of the things that have been highlighted, for example, the arguments that were made in the last petition, in the August petition. I think it would be good for media to start revisiting some of those. Why was that election annulled? We've become hostage as media to the propaganda from both sides. So you'll hear media people regurgitating something like, oh, the numbers were never questioned. The court validated the victory because it just, some forms were not stamped, which is really not true. But the fact that we regurgitate it says something about us and our knowledge of what the case was. And that then percolates down to the people who watch the news, who try to think the news will explain to them what happened, and they start saying this very thing. So it's important, I think, to go back, to refamiliarize ourselves with what was said, why it was annulled, what were the precedents set. And when the court said, redo this election in accordance with the Constitution, what did that actually mean, in terms of the specifics? So that when this petition now comes again, we can compare and see, well, this is what they annul, are they likely to annul it again? The second thing is not to be hostage again to the talk from two sides. I think we've got to break the model of how we do our panels, which is let's bring a NASA guy, let's bring a Jubilee guy, and let
them go at it.
Yeah, exactly. I think for too long, and this way, I don't think it's just about electioneering. I think it's basically how the media sees its job or prefers to do its job, let me say. I think it privileges the drama over the content. you know, that it is much more important and engaging to have Jubilee versus NASA.
Two people arguing.
Yeah, you know, yeah,
saying.
exactly. As opposed to deconstructing what they're saying. I think we've got to find more innovative, more entertaining, more riveting and captivating ways of actually explaining things. And if the measure of the media doing a good job is an informed electorate, you know, what we should end up with at the end of this entire process is people who actually understand this is what the petition was run on, this is how it was adjudicated, this is why it was thrown out, or the election is another second time, you know, and stuff. So that people actually know what's at stake. Okay. You know, and I think if that might be a process that then they carry on beyond the petition to how they cover other how we cover events and stuff, and that would be really great.
All right, Dr. Buka, I want us to move on to something else, but possibly on your article, you've said, let us make this particular coverage juicy. What does juicy mean from your angle? What is it that would make you feel that, yes, this time, the electorate, I think, is in a better place in terms of the media having covered the petition as opposed to the previous one?
Well, I don't decide the headlines.
Yeah.
My story, so even when I saw the headline, I was a bit shocked. But I think what I'm saying, you know, I do the write-up, and then, you know, the
somebody else comes decides, up with the header.
But essentially what I'm saying is that, one, that law is a complex subject, but it is the very foundation on which society exists. And that calls for something. That, one, we need to have depth in the kind of reporting you know, that follows petitions, or that accompanies petitions that are very important for the electorate. That there needs to be accurate reporting. You know, there needs to be a lot more diversity in the kind of content that we are seeing. And so beyond the panels, could we have open up the spaces, even in terms of who writes opinions, you know, who do we interview, where do we go to get these people? And I like what Julie says, that at the end of the day, you know, that voter who went out to cast their vote, or who didn't in the last election, they'll be following, you know, these proceedings. One, to validate why I stayed at home, or to validate why I actually went out to vote. You know, it has to make sense for them. Lawyers and a number of professional people sometimes tend to speak to themselves, you know, and you wouldn't blame them for that, because within the courtroom, that's their space, you know. But if we are let into that space as media, there's a reason why we are in there. Not to regurgitate what they're saying, but to be able to make meaning and make sense out of it for the consumer who's out there. So that's what the article was saying. If that's what juicy means, then
that's what we need. All right. Hopefully we're taking notes and we'll be able to get that. Let's move on to something else.
Yeah, just one last thing, if I may, very quickly, which has been a concern of mine for a while. I think the media has to be careful, taking out the reverse angle, about taking the language of the courtroom and applying it outside the courtroom. You know, guilty innocent until proven guilty, etc. These are things that they're conventions that are fine within courtrooms. But we, for example, cannot expect a citizenry to hold government to account by assuming it is innocent. You know, that the government is always put to task. You know, it's always being questioned and stuff. It's not always assumed to be doing good things. And that people aren't, you know, there's been a tendency, I think, for a very long time for us to listen to what lawyers say, you know, and then use that as if it should be the way we should be running our politics, you know, or how we should be discussing things. There's a place for courtroom discussions, and that's in the court. You know, and it is fine. But once you get outside of the court, let's be very careful about how we apply that language.
And I guess that speaks to what Dr. Buka is saying, that when we have an understanding of the law, then we're able to make it palatable. Yeah. Because the language in court and the language out here might be different. But we all agree that we are a divided nation currently. And one of the things that possibly may have played a huge role in that is propaganda. Julie, your thoughts on possibly how we have handled propaganda as the media, because just like you mentioned, we need to get neutral panels. We don't know if they exist, but we also sometimes are guilty as journalists and within the media house being partisan. And being partisan sometimes plays into how we report. And especially in light of propaganda. Sometimes we'll pick a story that we have not really done much research on, but it is propaganda, and publish it as truth or speak it as truth.
Yeah. I think we were caught flat-footed because the level of propaganda in these elections, let me call them elections, has been unprecedented. I don't think we've ever seen it before, where people are actively putting out fake news. Like I said one time, for every real news story, there are 10 fake posts.
Correct.
And I don't think we anticipated the level and the intensity of that. And so we got caught up. And our own biases, because this propaganda has become kind of psychosocial now, it's actually trying to touch people in the places where that's going to kind of trigger a particular response, and that response is often tribal and partisan. So even journalists were caught up in this whole thing where your psychology has also been messed with by the different news that is coming out from different areas, and you're trying to be an impartial arbiter, and all these things are kind of like hitting you in the face. And it was like pollution. It was like smog. You couldn't really tell what was true and what was fake until we realized that there was a systematic machine that was churning out all these things on both sides.
And it's still going on.
And
it hasn't stopped.
It hasn't stopped. And now everything that you encounter, you have to check, is this real or is this fake? I think that's the best thing that came out of it, was the fact that it forced journalists to check, double check, and triple check. It also exposed that everybody in this country has been affected by the political situation, and journalists included have a side. And how do you proceed knowing that you support one side or the other side with the intention to present information that is neutral?
Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Booker, there is the profession that we have. And that ought to guide us to some degree, especially when it comes to propaganda and whether we are partisan or not. Because truth be told, we're not immune. We're not living in a vacuum. We are in the space where politics is going on, and we also have an opinion. However, we have a professional duty to ensure that we inform the public, not based on our partisanship or what we believe or think is right, but what is truth. How do we get that balance? Because we're not immune.
I think, let's be realistic. Part of the challenge is not even just what you, as Michael, would have as your biases, but it goes much higher into, who owns the media houses in the country and what were their political leanings, what are their political leanings. We have seen evidence of stories that, you ask yourself, is this a planted story? And, what's the source? And, when we then, as main media or as legacy media, are not able to interrogate, some of that content, then we are playing into that gallery and propagating fake news and propaganda. I think professionally we want to ask ourselves, to who do we owe that moral responsibility? And why do we exist? Is it to serve public interest? And if that's the guiding principle, then all our content must be, at the end of the day, even when I have my biases, inherent biases, as a journalist, as a reporter, I have a higher call, and that's to be able to serve public interest. In a context such as, what we've had, the election, I think one of the things that's evident is that the public out there is looking for information that either reinforces what they believe or challenges, their opponent. And that is what has given rise to a lot of the fake news and the propaganda that we have seen. And the challenge is that we then, as mainstream media or legacy media, need to separate ourselves from that, because one thing is clear, that people need information, and they're looking for information. And they want information. What are we doing to be able to provide that information? Because when I'm on the social media space, I keep asking myself, okay, is this fake? Is this, And it's tiring sometimes to do that all the time. Just an interesting example is what happened yesterday with the death of the Nyeri governor. Correct. And the run-up to that was, there was so much on the social media space. Some of it you could tell this is, somebody's not verifying this information, but already it tells you that there is, there's such a yearn for information. So we need to understand that we now are more than relevant. I think our relevance as media cannot be gainsaid. What's important is, are we investing in ensuring that, one, we equip our journalists with the ability, even for them, to be able to distinguish what's fake and what's not. Because with the last election, we saw certain tweets from media houses, you know, being the first one to tell the story, but then at the end of the day, you're retracting it because you've realized what you actually put up there
It's not accurate.
was not accurate. Yeah.
All right, Gadara, and as we still look at propaganda, one of the other things that Dr. Booker has brought up is even as we look at the unfortunate death of the Nyeri governor, some of the pictures that the public put out there, and we can't stop them, but we have a duty to educate and let people know that sometimes there needs to be sensitivity. Some of these pictures may have even been going out before the immediate family is aware, and we just have this urge to have things out as soon as possible.
Well, I think there's very little media can do to stop anybody who's there, who's a witness, taking a picture, putting it out. Obviously, we can educate about being sensitive and stuff, but I wouldn't really place that too hard on the media. But I think I'll take it from two ways. First, on the propaganda issue, I think we've got to be careful to distinguish between propaganda and fake news. Not all propaganda is fake news. In fact, the most effective propaganda is basically a privileging, if you will, of particular perspectives. You know, so it's not fake in the sense that it tells lies, but it does distort in the sense that it puts weight on a particular perspective. You know, and that's what it insists on to be true. And I think our media has been particularly bad at deconstructing that bit. I think it has set itself up for the barrage of propaganda it's receiving now by not investing in an understanding of truth, of what's actually happening, but rather privileging this fight between, this political fight between two nemesis, whether it was Jubilee and CORD, now Jubilee and NASA. It's been happening for a very long time. And there has been no investment in actually understanding what's the history, what's the context, you know, what's the background to this thing, so that you can deconstruct what you're being told. I think another way that the media has made itself quite vulnerable to propaganda is, for example, by allowing the presidency to report on itself. So that lots of media, lots of newspapers especially, are fond of running what essentially are PSCU press releases as news about the presidency. You know, yeah, that's just a press release. That in itself is propaganda, but you put it on your pages as if it's a piece of news, instead of actually taking it, deconstructing it. The same way you'd get a press release from a company or whatever. You deconstruct it, you question it, you know, and stuff, and then you write a story about it. It's not letting them write for you. I think coming to, for example, the issue on the governor and the unfortunate demise of the governor yesterday, I think the media also has to go beyond telling the immediate story. The story was the governor died, you know. But I think there's a much wider, much more important story to be told about our road safety issues and how we need to tackle them, and how historically we have simply gone and demonized drivers and stuff, and not looked at the system on which our roads that we used to manage and send our roads. You know,
Today's
actually,
as far as I've seen, they've gone behind the headlines.
No, again, and that's why I differ. I mean, if you take, for example, people like Sweden. Sweden has the best, the safest roads in the world. One of the things that they passed as far back as 1997, you know, was a law that said that any crash on the road, any death or injury on the road is not the fault of the driver or the pedestrian. It's the fault of the guy who designed and maintains the road system.
But the governor
and
died
my point
yesterday.
is this. Yes, exactly.
and his death was
now,
actually
my
news.
thing is, the governor died yesterday. The week before we had Salga. You know,
and
over the whole year, we've had about
over
2,000.
All right.
Yes, but I'm saying, if you're going to be discussing the road safety, the road system and how it is managed, you know, as opposed to simply saying, yes, we have a black spot in Salga, you know, or we have a brass court in Kabati.
I think this road safety issue has been exhaustively covered.
Not exhaustively.
Yes.
In fact, it hasn't even been scratched.
And I'll need your wrapping thoughts. We're out of time. Julie, as you respond to that, your wrapping thoughts and possibly what we should expect, especially this coming week in regards to the Supreme Court, and maybe reportage that would give us more value for the time that we spend watching or reading our newspapers.
I think we've started off well. For example, the front page of the Standard today has actually broken down the various points in I think the 3 petitions that are before the court, 3 or 4, and I think it's also, the onus is also on readers and consumers of news to take what they're given and then go and read a bit further. You cannot give them everything. Gadara spoke about celebrity reporters reporting on the news. I'll mention one, Sophia Wanuna, I think the last time did a very good job of grasping the issues and trying to explain it. I think the challenge for all of us is just to simplify the English, like you're talking about courtroom language. Simplify everything so people can understand on the spot exactly what has happened without trying to figure out what does that word mean. But yes, we've started well. I hope we carry on well, and obviously for the country, I hope we come to some kind of conclusion and resolution this time.
All right, Dr. Booker, your closing thoughts?
I think one that, you know, just on what Gadara mentioned earlier about, you know, the traffic, the road safety, is that we have time now to be able to explore some of those angles that have been missing. I think let's not, you know, put too much expectations on media at one go. There is the day 2 journalism, and, you know, we want to see follow-up stories on that, because those are the questions that are now playing in the minds of people. And I know Gadara is looking at me. You know, how can you turn against me? But 2, you know, with the you know, the petitions before the Supreme Court, I think one of the things that we want to see is depth. You know, we want to see depth. And that depth means that we go back into context, go back into history, that we diversify our sources, that we interrogate the issues merely just beyond he said, she said, merely beyond, you know, getting you know, lawyers who are aligned to the political contestants or, you know, the respondents to the petition, but, you know, to what the public would like to hear. Okay. And also listening to, you know, those of the members of the public out there who at the end of the day have to abide, you know, by whatever it is that is the outcome. You know, what their thoughts are.
All right, we'll have to wind up right there because of time. I know, Gadara, you've not had your phone, but if I give you closing comments, I know we'll start an argument right here. So anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Nancy Booker, who is an assistant professor at Aga Khan University, Patrick Gadara, communications consultant, and Julie Masiga, who's a journalist. Thank you for joining us this morning in the newsroom, and that's where we wind up the newsroom. But do stay with us. We've got your health coming up, and well, today we'll be looking at antibiotics and the overuse of antibiotics and possibly what that means to your health. Do stay with us. Dr. Mercy Korir is going to be holding the reins on that, but your health is important, so do stay with us right here. For those of us on KTN Home, Life and Style is beginning. We say goodbye and wish you a good day. For those of you who'd like to get more information on your health, switch over to KTN News or stay on KTN News. We take a break. We'll be right back.